So good morning. Are we good to begin?
Yes, Noelle, I think we can start.
Okay. So good morning and welcome to our ADB-led event today, titled Climate and Disaster Risk Information for Climate Change Adaptation, looking at the challenges and the solutions. So my name is Noelle O'Brien and I work with ADB in ADB's Pacific Department. And I am very pleased today to have seven very knowledgeable experts from the region and from a number of the countries. Let me begin with CEO Rosamond Bing from Tonga's Ministry of Lands and Natural Resources. Let me just say that the bios for everybody has been shared. So I'm just going to give some very brief notes. Then beside Rosamond is Letea Bukoto. Letea is the team leader for disaster risk with the Disaster Risk and Community Resilience Program at the Pacific Community. So welcome, Letea, and thank you for joining us. Next, I see Alessio Giardino. Alessio is now a senior climate and disaster risk management specialist with ADB, but many of you in the Pacific will know Alessio from his work with Deltares. So welcome, Alessio, and great to have you with ADB. Wayne King is the Director of Climate Change at the Office of the Prime Minister with the Cook Islands. Thank you, Wayne, for joining us today. Next to Wayne, I see Mr. Doug Ramsey, who's the Pacific Manager at NIWA in New Zealand, the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research. Thank you, Doug. And then we have Ms. Artesa Saldivar Sali. Artesa is a senior municipal engineer with the World Bank. And then Dr. Anthony Keim. Anthony is associate professor at the Center for Water, Climate and Land at the University of Newcastle in Australia. So thank you to everybody for joining us today. Our plan for this session is for the seven experts that I've just introduced you to reflect on the generation of useful and credible risk information and how to incorporate the uncertainties of a changing climate in resilient spatial and infrastructure investment planning. We intend today to zoom in on the various perspectives on current and emerging understanding of climate risks in the region, on communicating climate risks effectively, and on designing adaptation measures and pathways and plans that address risks and support Pacific communities and the countries in resilient adaptation. Just to say, from ADB's perspective, we approved our Pacific approach for the 2021 to 2025 period earlier this year, and that has committed ADB to scaling up its work on climate change with the countries to move far beyond the climate proofing work that we had been doing and to focus on identifying, designing and implementing adaptation investments together with the countries. So this topic on climate risk information is actually critical for us to be able to work with the countries to inform this type of investment. So I have three questions that I'm going to discuss with panelists, and I'm going to begin by asking one question to talk about the status of climate risk information and projections for the region and the individual countries. So maybe I can begin by asking Anthony, how can we work towards ensuring that Pacific Island countries have access to specific and up-to-date climate risk information? And how can we continue to build on this as each year our understanding improves?
Thanks, Noelle. So the first thing I'll cover is the sea level rise information. So sea level rise is really important, obviously, for the Pacific. But it's also important to recognise that the science around sea level rise is rapidly changing, and the information that becomes available is getting updated all of the time. And most recently, we just had the update from the IPCC assessment report number 6. And so there's been updated global projections for sea level rise. But what's really important for the Pacific is to recognise that what's happening globally is not necessarily the same that's happening at the island scale, or even smaller scale than that. So what's needed to do increase climate resilience and improve adaptation in the Pacific is to undertake the downscaling exercises. So taking that global information and downscaling it so that it's turned into location-specific information about sea level rise that's relevant at the island or sub-island scale. And this is important in the Pacific because you've got atolls, you've got other bigger islands, and so each location is different. And so that downscaled location-specific information is really important. That's from a modelling perspective, but it's also important to recognise that the modelled information about sea level rise is just one part of it. What's also needed to improve adaptation in the Pacific around sea level rise is increased monitoring so increased data around sea level rise, tide gauges, and things like this. And again, this is because the impact of sea level rise varies quite a lot in space, and depending on the bathymetry and depending on the local scale physics in the Pacific. And so it's one thing to have the models putting out these projections, and the models are based on the best available science, but to have information that's truly useful in a practical sense, you need to marry that model information with a good observational network that's continually collecting data and making sure that data is quality controlled for as many places as possible. That's the sea level rise information. The other one I'll just mention quickly is, which I think is probably the second most important thing, and we've seen what's going on in Glasgow at the moment, is the extreme rainfall. So similar to sea level rise, extreme rainfall is an important thing to manage in the Pacific, but it's also something which we don't have much monitored or measured data for, particularly at the sub-daily scale. So if you're doing infrastructure development or any adaptation exercise, the important timescale for extreme rainfall is at that sub-daily scale. And so one of the first steps which would be good to do would be to improve the measuring of extreme rainfall. So when I say improve, increase the number of gauges across the Pacific, but also the quality control of daily and sub-daily extreme rainfall information. This is important because understanding the impacts of climate change on extreme rainfall, the general science is there that says in a warmer world, the magnitude of extreme rainfall will increase. And to date, the rule of thumb has been, we roughly follow the Clapeyron relationship, which sort of says for every degree of warming, the extreme will increase by about 5 to 6%. But studies from elsewhere in the globe, so not in the Pacific, have said that actually that's probably an underestimate. And so the increase in extreme rainfall is more like 15 to 20% per degree of warming. And the studies that have happened elsewhere in the world have been able to demonstrate this using observed data. So you can see the changes in the observed data. There's a handful of stations in the Pacific which we've been able to analyse, and we can see that the same thing, if not worse, is happening in the Pacific. But this is a very, very small snapshot. I'm talking 5 or 6 stations that have the amount of data that you can pick this up. So this is really important. We know that the magnitude of extremes will increase in the future. That's happening globally. We know it's also going to happen in the Pacific, but we really need improved monitoring of extreme rainfall at the daily and sub-daily scale to get a proper quantification of how exactly extreme rainfall will change in the Pacific. So that's my 2 main points.
And thanks, Anthony. And just to note that that paper that Anthony has done, the guidance on extreme rainfall, will be coming out from ADB quite soon, and we'll share that with the participants. And that does focus in on the 5 case studies that he's mentioned there. Alessio, can I move to you with the same question?
Yeah, thanks, Noel. Thanks, all participants. Yeah, maybe let me start also by saying that, yeah, the IPCC6 assessment report already has done quite some important step to also making sure that this information, regional information and local information, let's say, become available to the public. And for example, there is now that is available an interactive atlas also that provides this information to the public, which is freely available. And so this information by itself is also available to Pacific Island country. And this is something very recent, just from this recent IPCC report. And then, of course, besides the projection, the next step is to translate this information also to risk information for the specific Pacific Island country. And this risk information then can really make sure to local stakeholders what consequences are, for example, a different climate scenario, and also which decision may need to be taken to adapt. And as Anthony already mentioned, for that, numerical models are very useful and are already available and can support this process. What often is missing is the data behind to run those models. And for example, topographic data is one of the most important sources of data that are required to do this type of assessment. And of course, there are a number of studies that have already been done at the local scale using accurate data. For example, the Tongatapu multi-hazard risk assessment, which was financed by the IDB. The Marshall Islands was previously involved with previous work financed by the World Bank, for example. But still, these data are often still not available, let's say, for all different islands. They are still quite scarce, and global data is often not accurate enough to carry out this type of assessment. Nevertheless, new sources of data are also becoming available, for example, through remote sensing or mobility data. And I'm sure that this data will improve enormously this local assessment also during the coming years. And if I may add maybe just one quote is that I believe that in the battle, let's say, against climate change, small islands are likely to be the pioneers actually in the use of this new technology and also the new adaptation options, and may also be kind of maybe in the forefront compared to many other coastal countries around the world in the battle against climate change and the use of the new data and technology.
Thanks, Alessio. And continuing with the regional perspective, can I ask Latea to come in, particularly around the work of the Pacific community?
Sure. I mean, it's the science gives you a significant staging point to start the conversations on. However, in the interactions around how do we start to turn that into something that countries can actually action or to be able to plan around? One of the missing bits is actually translating that into impact stories for decision makers to be able to understand and comprehend. And those conversations are going to be really something that is ongoing. I mean, I've had discussions with development partners when trying to invest, and part of that discussion is actually around invest in the data that actually helps inform what you're trying to invest in. And that's the, you know, sort of a critical bridging that needs to be had with the link between what the development partners are engaging with the countries on for future and for existing investments. You know, we all talk about how there's data everywhere, and let's just make use of it. And unfortunately, some of the data is actually not in a state that can be used to inform some of those primary investments that countries are wanting to get into. And I think those conversations need to be quite honest. That the results using existing data may not actually be sufficient to provide countries with the level of security that what they're investing in is actually going to reduce, reduce the existing, but also future risks. No, I can talk about this forever, so I'm going to stop now.
Okay, all right. I'm going to come back to you with the second question, fit to follow through on that. But let me go next to Doug, please.
Hey, thank you, Noel, and good morning, everyone. So I think just to reinforce what the first three panelists are saying, you know, the kind of the big gap is really about how we translate that information down into to support local or sector level decision making. And that's not a one size fits all. We need to get better at understanding what is the kind of information we actually need at that community level in the Outer Cook Islands, what the water sector actually needs to make that decision and produce that risk information directly to support that information. We also need to think better at how we communicate uncertainties around there. As Anthony mentioned, there's huge uncertainties in sea level rise and other climate change kind of projections. And we need to get better at cascading that down and explaining much more effectively kind of how those different uncertainties may alter kind of the way that we respond to those uncertainties. And just picking up on the core data aspects, I mean, we've been talking about this for 20 or 30 years, you know, for some of the most kind of sea level kind of impact challenged kind of countries in the world, the lack of topography. I mean, only Samoa and Tuvalu have their whole entire kind of countries captured with high resolution LiDAR data. Everywhere else, it's 1 or 2 meter, 1 or 5 meter kind of contours that are available there. So why don't we begin to set some targets for collecting some of this core data? Why don't we say by 2025 or 2030 that every inhabited island in the Pacific needs to have LiDAR captured? And that needs kind of coordination and support from the donor community to enable that to happen. Anthony talked about some of the long-term climate records. Now, Australia's done a fantastic job with the sea level kind of network. You know, we've got 12 or 13 gauges around the Pacific region that have been in place since 1993 or so. So 25 to 30 years worth of data. That data is only just becoming kind of really valuable. He mentioned the rainfall kind of data sets, and yes, we've got, you know, long-term records for daily rainfall, but sub-daily rainfall is the lack of sub-daily rainfall information is having a huge limitation on how we can design stormwater systems, drainage systems, and other type things. So we can't be in the situation in 20 or 30 years' time with the same patchy data sets. So we need to think about how we're doing things different. My own organization, I mean, we've been fortunate to working with many of the Pacific Island Met services and put in somewhere about 180 to 200 rain gauges and automatic weather stations over the last 10 or 12 years. But how we support and maintain all those kind of stations going forward, how we can leverage kind of the information, develop climate services and develop products that support local decision making and create a demand for that information and sustaining of those networks is critically important. I think the last thing I'd say in terms of the gaps is, and we're going to use a food analogy here, and most of you know me, I like my food, and that's probably why I kind of enjoy working in the Pacific so much. But we also need more kind of chefs. What I mean is we have a lot of ingredients. You know, kind of we always want more and better ingredients, as Lydia pointed out, but a good chef can make a meal out of the ingredients that he actually has. And what we do and how we use these ingredients is important. And we need to be creating those meals. We need to be making those decisions now. So although while we don't have perfect information and we don't have perfect ingredients to make those kind of meals, what's missing is probably a lack of kind of chefs in the region. So more emphasis on developing that local capacity to utilize the information we have to kind of target that for the specific sector or the specific community or a specific for the specific context that we're actually using that information for. So I'll leave it.
Thanks, Doug, and very important point that you've just brought up there. So let me move straight into Rosamond to look at this question, particularly from the Tonga context.
Thank you very much, Noelle, and thank you to the former speakers for setting the scene. As you know, Tonga has been fortunate to be working together with ADB, and Alessia referred to literally hot off the press is a multi-hazard disaster risk report for the main island here in Tongatapu. As a second-ranked highly vulnerable country in the Global Vulnerability Index, this is a quite a critical tool for Tonga. And I say this for the reasons that's already been referred to previously. It has collated almost 120 data sets, mulched it together with our local capacity in terms of the methodology we used, and we have a report, which maybe is the chef analogy that Doug referred to. But what I found useful with this report is as part of the process of engaging our stakeholders, the methodology was to set up focus groups, and we assigned different ministries and different stakeholders to these groups. So we had a hazard assessment group, a social vulnerability, and assets exposure and vulnerability, and a risk outputs and planning inputs. So what we did was to allocate our staff from the different relevant ministries to work together with the ADB technical team and the ARUP firm that worked together with us. And we had to do this by Zoom. We were expecting the team to be here. But this was our first Zoom and a remote approach. And I think it worked quite well. It took a bit of a commitment. But what was important is that we all pulled together this complex technical information and data sets that's available and tried as best as we could to apply that to the Tongan context. And the questions that Anthony referred to earlier, you know, sea level rising, what is applicable at the Tongan level? So that was all put together, and now we have a report. In my view, is very much Tongan because we took a lot of effort to bring in a lot of our technical people. I think one of the things that I was very happy with is we brought in our young graduates, and that's where Doug, I think, was referring to. I tried as much as we can to engage the young graduates so that they have those skills are built up. And I think we had a very good working relationship with ARUP because most of the team members we're familiar with. So that's what we have here. That covers Tongatapu. 70% of the population is based here. I'm sitting right in front of our tidal gauge that was replaced a couple of years ago, across from the wharf, but all of our investments are here. So we have to now consider where to best place our investments. Infrastructure, this is the CBD. It is going to be the document that we will use and the report that we will use to work together with our development partners, but most importantly, use it locally because it's locally generated information and a locally generated report. So we're just at stage one. So as Doug said, I'm not quite sure who the chef is going to be. I think I'm part of the chef because Cabinet has approved for this ministry to be the repository of the very thick report with data, information, maps, you name it. That's going to be my key responsibility. Thank you, Noel.
No, thank you very much, Rosamond, and thanks for that great summary. And I know Wayne is on the panel here today, and I know we at ADB have been talking to the countries, but I mean, I think now that Tonga has indicated that the reports can be released, I'd also encourage the countries to also reach out and chat with you and to learn, because certainly from our perspective, having the ministries working together to lead the process has been one of the huge successes. Just from the listeners, the video that summarizes the work, it's just being finalized. We will share that in the other ADB events, I think on November 9th or November 11th, and we will have the link up on the ADB website by then, and start to release the reports also. Wayne, can I come across to you? I mean, because I know you're now thinking of more of this systematic scale analysis in the Cooks, and to just hear your perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, and good morning, colleagues, as well, or good afternoon. Yeah, it's very much in this sort of similar flavor of what we've heard, but I suppose for a little bit of differentiation, it's an understanding of the objective of why we're doing this. So without even thinking about climate change, risks are a big factor in our development, you know, financial risks, infrastructure risks, hazard risks. So there is a conglomeration of risk information already compiled. Our government, with its own resources, has undertaken hazard risk assessment. So we're fully aware of those. And as we overlay the climate lens on this, we get a much better and a much more comprehensive picture of what it is we're going to do with this information around risk. Obviously, it is about investments. And it was interesting that the previous speakers, particularly Doug and others, were really focusing on sort of the sources. So if you looked at it, we're downscaling all the time in the sense of IPCC, we're looking at their discussion, even at regional levels, and then we're looking at the region itself and what comes out of that, CSIRO, NIWA, other university areas, and then we're looking at ourselves as a country. So we have this, I call it downscaling sort of way of looking at climate risk. We're very fortunate in the sense that ADB itself we're working very closely on a TA on some very critical infrastructure, one of our ports and our international airport, to understand better climate risks around those particular assets. But also we have a very large project that we're a part of, funded by the Green Climate Fund, on UNEP Climate Services. So UNEP is the 5-country accredited entity. And that really starts to drill in as well about data collection, automatic weather stations, interpretation of information back to communities, and not in so much in real time, but very close to it. So we have this very much comprehensive way of looking at climate risk. And as we heard, LIDAR is a very much an integral part of that. And Doug explained that as well. We're very, very fortunate, as I said, that the Green Climate Fund is able to help us fund that for a few $1 million, as well as the New Zealand government. So together, we're going to be able to do 15 islands of the Cooks under LIDAR. And that forms a very good basis, a very multi-benefit tool, but forms the basis of how we're going to look at risk itself. Going beyond that, obviously, it leads us down a pathway of what is it we're going to do with this information. And I must say that we've, under our NDC, under our national infrastructure plans, we won't call it integrated urban infrastructure, but very sort of close to it. It could be framed in that way. We're going to be able to look at the types of investments and the costs around those assessments, including climate change, just based on that information we're gathering. So very much an integral part of our work. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne. And now coming across to our Tessa, who's been team leading the work out of the World Bank in the Marshall Islands. Over to you, Artessa.
Thanks, Noelle. Yeah, so just to share a little bit of background, the World Bank has supported the government of the Marshall Islands to develop what they call their long-term adaptation pathways. So 100+ year adaptation horizons horizon. And we've worked with Alessio in his former life and Doug as well on this work. So there's quite a number of us here who are very familiar, maybe more familiar than I am with the detail of this work. But just to give an overview, I think the overarching question was, how can the culture, the society, the communities of the Marshall Islands continue to pursue their opportunities? And in very simple terms, how can the main islands, the population centers of the Marshall Islands remain habitable into the future, knowing that these climate-related, sea level rise-related hazards are being faced, and understanding, of course, the great uncertainty inherent in the projections. So one thing that I will say that I think we all found very important, and is perhaps the flip side of this data coin, is exposure information. So where are the assets? Where is the fixed infrastructure? Where are the buildings? Where are the community centers? Where are populations? And where are people living and going about their business and living their lives? Because we can have as sophisticated a set of hazard information. We can know the geographical distributions of the frequency and intensity of events. We can do all the climate downscaling in an ideal world. But really what is the other side of this question is, what sort of impact does it have on people, on assets, on communities, on essential government services? So the work in the Marshall Islands, I think, was really quite interesting. And the story map, the visualization platform of this work is now publicly available on the World Bank website. And I can share the site in the chat box if anybody's interested. But it was really about collecting and connecting these different layers of data, both hazard information and projections, of the impacts of sea level rise and inundation and so forth, but also their impact on specific assets. And so Alessio in his former life and the Deltares team really did quite some heavy lifting to understand the exposure of assets, the exposure of buildings, the exposure of hospitals and essential government services like schools and so forth. So I think that when we're talking about the question of habitability and usability of fixed assets, this exposure data and information becomes very, very important. Also, population and demographic projections, right? Because just as there's uncertainty in the impacts of climate-related hazards and sea level rise, so is there uncertainty in demographic and population movement. So trying to understand where people are going within a country, where people are settling, and where population centers are likely to be in the future is quite an important question. And it's an important question also for investment planning and the levels of protection that countries must invest in, and whether there will be a need to raise land, reclaim land, move populations within and across islands and so forth. So that understanding is really critical. And I think that habitability lens really is one of the interesting aspects of the work that we supported the government of the Marshall Islands to undertake. Thanks.
Thanks, Artessa. And I mean, I think it's just really great timing that we have this event, but we also have these two really significant pieces of work. This work from you on the Marshalls, and then our work on Tonga, and particularly the context of the atoll countries versus the island of Tonga Tapu, which obviously has very different adaptation options to the Marshalls. And I think with the group that we have here, it would be really good to see this discussions continue and to look at what we've learned from these two studies. And I mean, one in terms of how it influences future studies, future analysis, but also how it helps us inform this whole conversation about adaptation pathways going forward. So really super timing, I think, for this. And we will share the links for both sets of work. I want to come now to just a more specific question to three of our panelists. I'm going to ask Latea to pick this up first. I want to just understand what has been the experience with generating and communicating climate risk information in a way that is understood by those who need it, and by those at community level, planners, decision makers, and particularly our political level decision makers. And what good practices can you share with the group? Latea, can I ask you to respond first, please?
Thanks, Noel. The questions that you probably start with for this is probably the starting point for the discussions around what it is that we're going to actually bring together. What data we're collecting, what are we curating, what are we producing? So sometimes those questions are ones that we actually do have to tease. And it's really this need for us to be able to actually understand who the primary user is for what we're generating, and what are the questions that they're actually wanting answered by the initiative or by the product that's being produced, and ensuring that the metrics that is being used to gauge risk or to produce and the communication products is actually one that's actually understood. And I go back to earlier work that was done with the World Bank around understanding what tropical cyclone and earthquake risks were for the Pacific region. And having these conversations at first with the with the primary collectors of data was actually a more difficult one to have than to have the discussions with the ministries of finance, who immediately went, okay, so we don't actually understand what those future risks are for us, potential future risks are for us. Can you help us generate that information? So, SPC's part, or the Pacific Community's part in this was a lot smaller, but it was interesting to have those conversations then with the Ministry of Finance to go, do you at the moment actually document what the impacts are of disasters for your country? And we realized very quickly that the technical reports were there, but often weren't in a centralized repository that allowed us to very quickly come through, and hence the discussions then with various agencies. I mean, Rosamond is here representing the Ministry of Lands, having discussions with them around what is it that you're actually having. But having those conversations with the primary end user of what it is that you're producing was actually quite key. It's no use having metrics around monetary risk if what you're actually wanting to understand is mobility concerns relating to men, women, people with with special abilities, children. So the tailoring that information product to the person who's actually going to be utilizing it and using it. And that for us has been the conversations that take a bit longer, but have actually helped define how data is collected. And really trying to streamline that effort, and also ensuring that the data that is being used and produced can actually be used across different purposes. And some of that actually does mean understanding the context of the country that you're working in. And Alessio and Rosamond have both spoken to this, Matessa, around the work that's taking place in the Marshall Islands and Tonga. I won't speak for what they're doing. However, that's learning that's come a long way for us, at least in the region, being able to have those conversations with people we would not normally have discussions around climate and disaster risks.
And Latea, sorry, are there any other specific examples, in particular around coastal inundation or particular work that you've been involved with that you think it's good practice?
So the the discussions that are currently, I mean, I can go back to work that colleagues of mine who work in the coastal inundation space are having currently with the meteorological services, who tend to issue inundation warnings. What's been interesting is that the warning side is taking place and is, you know, quite developed. The discussions have matured, but the response side, which is taking that information to do something about it, is often disconnected. So, you know, being able to bring the disaster management practitioners to the table with the warning centers, and often just having these really honest to goodness discussions around, is this information understood by you? And I'll go back to a piece in Tonga. You know, Pacific Islanders love the fear of God scenarios. You know, the doomsday scenarios, because they actually grapple, you know, they grab your attention when it comes to discussing this with the disaster managers. And I will reflect the disaster management because I think it's actually understanding what these, you know, the immediate risks are that are going to help with these discussions that we're having currently, with being able to portray that this is what you would potentially need to mitigate in the disaster sense, or to try and adapt to in terms of the investment. And for us, it's actually bringing those two, probably the science as well as the decision makers who would interpret and take that science forward at the same table and having those conversations is really something that for the region we found to be valuable and is much needed.
Thanks a lot, Letea. Rosamond, can I ask you to pick up on the conversation there?
Thank you, Noel. The reference, the description I made earlier about the technical working groups, the focus groups, I think what took a bit of time was getting the group to gather what information we had, first of all, and then to share it. So I think in starting this work in terms of developing the report, Maltese Disaster Report, that was the key. It was trying to get the relevant actors together to bring up the information that they had, and then to share it with the team so that we could collaborate on how it would be assessed in the outcome of the report. Having said that, I think one of the key challenges, and we discussed this before this panel, now the next challenge is to communicate that report to different levels nationally, to the grassroots, to the communities, to the people that are affected, to this whole CBD, to the government. So that's where I see, that's where I know the challenge is going to be, especially being the repository of all of this data. What am I going to do with the maps? How am I going to present it to the community so that there's no anxiety, there's no worry, but we're able to present it in a manner that provides sound, comfortable advice to the communities that we are looking towards our future. And what Letea referred to before, and I think Atessa as well, this is about translating this information so that our people understand that there is an impact to what is happening to us. It's going to impact on our livelihoods, it's going to impact on how we conduct, plan, invest, and conduct our affairs into the future. So where we're at with this report is that we are now looking towards the pathway, and Atessa referred to where the Marshall Islands is currently at. That's where we're looking to next. But to go through that journey, and we're currently assessing now the firm that's the firms that have applied, is to have to be able to work with a team that has an appreciation for the local context, and those who have regional experience, and also I think are very mindful of the sensitivities around having technical information and how that's going to, we're going to need to speak to people and discuss with people new ways of conducting our lives. I've been involved with land acquisition for projects. We had a 2009 tsunami, relocating a community into 2 different locations, moving them into new estates and new cultural norms, different places that they were not used to. It's not a small task. And if you're doing that on a small scale, when you look at the bigger scale here on the main island, where as Atessa referred to, norms are different. People are more informed about their rights, their responsibilities, and it's not going to be without its challenges. But I think as long as we collaborate, as long as we formulate the way we approach these issues, we've had recently working more and more with NGOs in sort of the oceans and maritime domain. We found different ways to work with different partners who have a different approach, different perspectives, and we can all work together, I think, to drive forward these issues, because it has to be based on sound science. It has to be very mindful of social and economic norms and the way we live our lives. So whilst it's a challenge, I think if we're able to draw together the best of our stakeholders, it's going to be hopefully something that we can work with together at the national level.
Well, I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I feel that with the multi-hazard process, as you said in the beginning, it was a Zoom process. And we were all learning with Zoom, and we were all learning to deal with COVID and to actually make things happen without country missions. And so there were a lot of things that started to fall through the cracks, and we were so busy catching up on those that we didn't put that emphasis on reaching out to the community during the process. And that's very, very clear to me. But I think from your perspective, it will be really helpful to kind of think how would we might have done that differently if we had all been on the ground and we had some NGOs and civil society groups that we started to engage with. So I think that's a lesson we need to bring into future processes. And so I think it would be great if you can also consider that and inform future processes.
And I think that's where we'll, when we move towards the pathway, which is the next stage, we will very much emphasize on. But I think in hindsight, when you're collecting technical information and producing this type of report, it's probably better to work within the way that we worked. And then from here, we should be committing to taking this out to the communities and addressing their concerns and providing in the format that they can understand, because we can't just throw all this technical information at them. We run the risk of our future plans and where we're trying to get being sabotaged or just influenced by a different perspective of impact. So I think what Atessa referred to is actually quite important, being culturally sensitive. So we'll work to move that forward in the next stage towards the pathway.
And I think that's a really good point to bring Alessio back in and to share some of the lessons of and the experience from your work and how you felt that you were engaged with the various groups and how that influence was built.
Yeah, thanks, Noel. I think Rosamond mentioned already some important points. The fact that this information should be based on sound science. But at the end of the day, you have to make sure that this information also is conveyed to the stakeholders and to the public. So it has to be also easy to understand and simple. Visually also, I mean, the visual part of this risk assessment is very important also. And Artessa referenced before of this work based on story maps. I thought story maps, I think, are a really nice mean to convey this message to the public and to the stakeholders, because this information at the end, it has to be used throughout the stakeholder consultation process and the planning process. Another point maybe I would like to raise is also the importance of making sure that the process, the uncertainties also is really discussed and conveyed in the the planning process. And so it is important to look at a range of climate scenarios, give an indication of the possible futures, and also give an indication of a range of adaptation pathways which can address these uncertainties. There is no one only adaptation pathway that may, let's say, exist, but there will be a range of adaptation pathway that will depend on the uncertainties in the climate scenario, but also uncertainty in the demographic trends, as Artessa also mentioned before. So all these uncertainties really need to be conveyed as part of the stakeholder consultation and planning process to make sure that people really understand that these uncertainties are there and will always be there actually in the process. I think you are muted.
Yeah, thanks, Alessio. And coming back then, before the last question, can I just indicate to the participants that if you have a question for any of our panelists, please pop it in the chat and we'll take that up also. But just maybe as a last point from each of the panelists, can I ask you to share some perspectives or insights into from risk assessment, so for getting from risk assessments to developing plans and actions that result in adaptation or resilience outcomes, or maybe even the step before achieving the outcomes, but that are leading to design of investments that will have adaptation or resilience outcomes, and that can also secure climate finance. Maybe Anthony, I might ask if you have any thoughts that you want to come in on with that.
So I'll talk about just quickly. I think I agree with everything that everyone said about the importance of dealing with uncertainty, coming up, realizing that there's multiple plausible scenarios and there's multiple adaptation pathways. But when we're considering these adaptation pathways, and I think this came out in the Tonga study, but it's also come out in the example we had here in Australia in the floods that happened in March and the bushfires before that. So when we're thinking about adaptation, it needs to be holistic. So your objective might be, the Australian example, to communicate the risk of bushfires to people living in a house. And so there was a lot of education done to help people make their house protected from a bushfire, and they did all the cleaning of the surrounding bushland and whatnot. But what people didn't think was, in a catastrophic scenario where people have to evacuate, how do they evacuate? And so what happened was all these people's individual houses were as safe as they possibly could be, but that means nothing if you have to evacuate and there's no evacuation process. And so this concept of, and so what actually happened was the people had a false sense of security that they would be safe because they'd done everything they needed to do to protect their individual house. And this actually led to a maladaptation, whereas this what I'm trying to get at is these things need to be considered holistically. A similar sort of thing can happen where you might have a reservoir which you put in place for water security or hydropower. But if you have a really extreme event and that reservoir fills, it could exacerbate the flood risk, right? And so there's multiple scenarios, there's uncertainty with the scenarios, there's multiple adaptation pathways, but you need to make sure that whatever adaptation you're doing to increase the climate resilience of one thing is not making things worse on the other thing. So I see this as a big challenge going forward with the Pacific, because there's multiple climate threats happening simultaneously, and in some cases compounding the impact of each other. But in some cases, the adaptation strategy to mitigate one climate threat, so for example, drought and water security, might actually magnify the flood risk or something like that. And so I don't have a solution for that. It's just a challenge that I want to highlight when we're thinking about these things, particularly, people tend to do things on a project by project basis, and the focus is on the project. but we need to think about these things. The projects are not happening in isolation. So that's just one comment.
Thanks, Anthony. And that's a really important point that we've been also discussing at ADB. So it's that it's looking at the whole range of potential solutions and the whole cost benefit analysis of those solutions before identifying the kind of investment. It is one of the factors that we feel needs to be considered. Maybe Doug, can I come to you next?
Thanks, Noel. Yeah, I think just building on from Anthony's comments, taking a more focus on that systems kind of level thinking in a number of kind of ways, kind of thinking out from a development lens and integrating that into all kind of planning and budgetary processes is critical. Taking that longer term kind of perspective needs to be, as some of the kind of previous speakers have said, needs to be both vulnerability and impacts focus, and getting away from the kind of individual project by project kind of basis, as Anthony was kind of suggesting. It's not a case of just building a seawall to protect the community there. When we build a seawall, we often find that development actually increases behind the seawall. So it's looking at that wider development kind of context and addressing kind of the wider developmental issues as well. And the same with ecosystem-based kind of adaptation. It's not just about mangrove kind of planting. It's about thinking in the protection sense about that entire coast protection function of the coastline there, from the reef flat, mangroves, the seagrass, the beach, the land behind the beach. If you're planting mangroves, but you aren't kind of constraining the development that's happening right on the beach, kind of behind that, you aren't really going to create much, kind of reduce risk all that much. So it's thinking about that bigger kind of systems level thinking. I think just to change tack, but I'm going to focus on one thing. It's also about identifying the enablers of change, and I'm going to focus on one thing. Infrastructure has a critical role to play there. Where infrastructure is placed is where we find development happening. Now, a good example is Nandi in Fiji, where, say, the Nandi back road that was built kind of two or three decades ago, across one of the most exposed kind of flood risk areas in Nandi, and we now see kind of development happening along the Nandi back road in very highly exposed places. So thinking about the role that infrastructure has placed in terms of where development actually happens, the where you build has a critically important role. Work that I've been involved with for 22 years so in Kershai, infrastructure in the right place was one of the barriers to people relocating back from the coastline. So Kershai, most of the infrastructure is located on a narrow storm berm, although it's a high island with about 85% of the population located on this narrow storm berm. And discussing kind of the barriers to kind of people moving inland, the lack of the road, the lack of the water supply, the lack of the telecommunications, electric supply, because those were all around kind of the shoreline. That's where people kind of developed, because that's where it's easy to access that infrastructure. So, kind of taking a multi-general approach, putting the development in the right place will go an awful long way to helping kind of communities kind of to adapt either in urban, peri-urban areas, or indeed in rural communities. But taking that kind of intergenerational approach by putting infrastructure in the right place is critical. And I think just to finalize, just touching back to a few of the panels in the second question there, critical to this is about creating kind of ownership, both in the Marshall Islands kind of context and the Tonga context. We've seen, kind of a lot of technical work that's been done with the government there, but this really needs to be kind of a journey together, as Rosalind and Alessio kind of adhere to. Kind of we need to be putting this into the context of the people that live there. In an atoll environment, you don't live on an atoll for a couple of thousand years without some idea of resilience. So that kind of knowledge needs to be the foundation that everything else kind of builds on. Kind of doing the work, the technical work, the risk assessment work that we need to do needs to build on the context of the situation in whatever kind of community that we're working with there. So thank you. Oh, sorry, Noel, you're on mute.
No, you're okay. No, thanks, Doug. Maybe Artessa, can I ask you to pick up on that point? Or if there's anything you want to add?
Yeah, thanks, Noel, and thanks, Doug. I think that this idea of the ownership of governments and society and community, ownership of risk information and ownership of adaptation pathways is really very important. And I realize it's ironic that I'm speaking about this work when in fact we were just supporting the government of the Marshall Islands with this. But I think that one key aspect is that we can generate as much hazard and risk information and impact scenarios and adaptation options and pathways as we like. And in fact, the work in the Marshall Islands also generated order of magnitude cost estimation. But if we only go with what the technical results are telling us, what the cost estimations are telling us, what the economic analyses are telling us, those might inform certain decisions to choose certain adaptation pathways, but those are not always the adaptation pathways that the country is going to end up electing to go with, because there is so much more than just the traditional benefit streams that we are talking about. When we talk about, strategies for protection, raising of land, reclamation of land, relocation of communities, and the ultimate last resort of international migration, which certainly in the Marshall Islands is seen as the option of very last resort. The economic analysis would bear out some of these options that really are not culturally and socially acceptable and are not in line with the aspirations of the country. So I think that it's really important to note that while we can throw the data and the analysis and the technical chops at some of these problems and try to come up with adaptation pathways, the trigger points or the tipping points or the ultimate factors by which a society will make decisions are not almost never just purely technical or purely economic. So I think that when we do things like develop these visualization tools and these studies, it's really important to note that adaptation planning and investment planning by governments and by countries can be informed by them. But ultimately, there may be an aspiration that supersedes what our risk and hazard analysis and information can generate. So I think it's very important to keep at the top of our minds for those of us who are in the back seat here, to remember that the technical information and answers, quote unquote answers, don't nearly go all of the way to answering the problem. And so the best that we can hope to do is to provide input into countries and governments' decision-making processes. And in the end, the answer may not be technical at all. And that's something that we should acknowledge and celebrate in a way, and support to the best of our ability. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Artessa. And I think, Wayne, if you don't mind, I might ask you to come in on that point.
Yes, gladly. And I think Doug, of course, all the others, but Doug and Artessa really did start to vocalize these points about it's not just risk assessments based on sound science, but it's actually there's a qualitative part of that, and that is not just engaging the community, but understanding what communities are actually saying. So in our northern group atolls, that, as Doug sort of referred to them, that some of those people are the most resilient that you'd find because they're surviving on those atolls without resources, as we would think of them already. So I think making sure that that integrated approach is number one. And I think there is these aspects around influences or enablers, and political is obviously one we've all got a big challenge with, the political aspirations of our governments. That's just part and parcel of the work that we've really got to deal with in the context of risk and how we look at investments. I do want to touch on just one area which I think leads us down this pathway, and that is, as I said originally, why are we doing all of this? And in our minds, one of the key things is about investments. So finance essentially plays a pivotal role in all of this. Otherwise, why would we do it? And I think in this context, we need to look at the types of modalities that are available to us, even with ADB and our development partners and others, multilateral partners and all. We've had a look at all this, ADB and ourselves. We're very much engaged in this. A couple of years ago, we came out with an idea which we thought was a bit flaky, but actually worked quite well. And that was, we called it a roundtable. We brought all of the development partners and everyone together, and we said, this is our plan, you know, who's interested? And it actually turned out to be quite a major achievement in hindsight, because everyone understood that not one group could do everything as one big sort of plan, but everyone took sort of small pieces of it, and the government ourselves particularly were able to put it together. So we became jigsaw puzzle experts. That's what I always refer to it, where we bring all the pieces together and we've got a large picture. And so this is an essential component of it all, and finances. When we come to adaptation financing, this is a critical area that's right hot topic at the moment, obviously in COP26. But what we have to understand in bringing this little discussion here is that if I take the Cook Island context, we were pre-COVID at somewhere around about 22% of our debt ratio of loan. Today we're at 65 and climbing. We know Fiji, we had a discussion, they're at 95% debt ratio. And even just yesterday, we were talking with our colleagues in Belize, and they're at 127% of debt ratio because of, let's just say, COVID. We layer that with climate risk, and suddenly we've got this interesting looking dynamic. So I suppose what we're saying is that finance will always play that pivotal role, because it's the pathway we take to get there, which is what we're all talking about really here. But we've got to remember, it's not just science. There is other inputs that we need to take care of, and that is the people who live there, the communities. And I think ultimately we would never think that this is a government pathway, that this is for the people itself, and our focus is on integrated approaches. So I think that's where I should stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wayne. Before we start to wrap up, can I ask Litea, do you want to come in?
Thanks, Noah. I mean, I guess the point made earlier by by the other members of the panel really sum up that it's not just about the science, and that's been something that we've realized, I think, for a while in the region. Hence that importance of actually engaging and understanding some of the social and cultural values when discussing risk assessments and how we use them to come up with solutions. The one discussion that we've been having a lot with the countries that we've been working with as well is that you need to be thinking about that suite of options that you are considering. The infrastructure investment is one aspect of it. There is, however, a whole suite of other options that you also need to be working through as well. The discussions also need to involve our scientific community. We often see them as the starting point of the conversation. However, if we're going to be having those discussions, I think it is quite important to be bringing the science into the discussions that we are currently having, along with what the intentions are for the countries that we work with. And being able to make those risk information products or the risk assessments themselves open and accessible to other sectors that we would work with, getting the private sector involved in those discussions. This is, having the discussions with government, and also bringing our private sector to the table with those discussions. You know, and I think that that's probably an interaction that we're probably not engaging with, you know, in a intentful way, which is probably something we could do in the future, which is really to be intentful around those engagements in the countries that in the countries and with the private sector, with the community, civil society, and so on.
Yeah, the whole suite of actors must be part of the process. Alessio, can I ask you to comment, please?
Yeah, maybe I can start also by quoting the very recent Nobel Prize winner, Mr. Wannabe. And he said actually that making climate policy is actually 1,000 times more difficult than making climate predictions. So I think this is the challenge that we are having now, to pass from, let's say, climate projection into something that is action. I think that all the previous speakers have already summarized very well what the challenges and perspectives are in doing that. I think maybe in my opinion, the most important items are that, I mean, short-term actions should always come into, let's say, alongside, let's say, long-term planning actions. So we should never exclude one or the other one, but we should make sure that the two, let's say, work hand in hand. Stakeholders involvement is always crucial in all this process, and that's really something that, based on my experience, is really important to make sure this actually is at the end is successful. And also based on experience, I mean, for example, in the study of the Marshall Islands that we did is, we estimate cost, we look into financing and so on. And what you then realize is the real importance that, because at the end, the costs to adapt are huge. And that therefore it's really important then to have a good coordination between donors, with the governments, but also the private sector, to make sure that everybody is well aligned, and make sure that this pathway at the end can actually then be implemented. So let's say coordination is very important also on the financial side of things. Yeah, thanks, Noel.
Thanks, Alessio. And Rosamond, are you still with us to come in and?
Thank you, Noel. I think just where we're at with the report, and where I see its value and its contribution to actions and plans. We're halfway. I think we're conducting our midterm review on the Tonga Strategic Development Framework, which is our overriding government development initiatives. We're also updating our national infrastructure investment plan. And this was also feed into our joint national action plan on disaster risk reduction and disaster risk management. But I think one of the key projects that we are working together with ADB is the, and I go back to who used the word evacuation, I think it was Anthony, to the Evacuation Bridge, which is a major infrastructure connecting the CBD to across the lagoon. Now we're connecting the CBD to and landing on ecosystems. We're landing on arable agricultural land. We're connecting to the central district. So thinking ahead in terms of these major national plans and looking at it from a holistic approach, as Doug and Anthony had referred to, and the impact and what infrastructure creates. One of the issues for us, of course, is once it lands on the arable agriculture land, what then happens to that land use? It immediately changes the nature of agriculture land. We have to plan where this road is. I mean, it's an evacuation bridge, but it's also a pathway. Whilst we're looking ahead to how we're going to invest in major infrastructure, where we're looking at the Nuku'alofa coastline in terms of the projections that we've had and the mapping modeling. So it's a very interesting, it's going to be interesting. It's, I think, and it's going to require some very hard decisions to be made. In the meantime, I think what we have is at least the networks, the partnerships. Now we have a report, and we're going to escalate that to the future. So for me, this discussion has been very useful in terms of, like Wayne said, reflecting on where we're going to place our investments very much within the climate change lens. Because as he says, COVID has hit our shores. Financing is going to be a major challenge. With our dependency on development and funding from external partners is going to become something that's very much a key issue in terms of how we approach these. And I think Atessa did refer to that as well. Whilst we can have all of these technical reports, if there's no financing and it doesn't meet what may be our national aspirations, retreat, resettlement, relocation, and all of those issues require some very, very in-depth thought. And I think a contribution from everyone so that whatever decisions are made, I think most importantly, the security of our people is paramount. Thank you, Noel.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rosamond. I'm glad you brought up the question of the bridge. There is a further piece of analysis coming through, hopefully within the next 24, 36 hours, on actually bringing together this whole, how does the bridge look, knowing what you now know with the multi-hazard. So that will be shared with you as soon as we're comfortable with the peer review, the initial peer review of it. I think this has been a fascinating conversation, and from my perspective, just part of a much longer term process on how this conversation continues and how we build on the lessons from the work that we've done so far, certainly at ADB, but also from the work that everybody else is doing. I can't see any questions, but if I can give a last opportunity for any of the panel, the participants to put a question to any of the panelists, even or any of our own team, Jeff or Alexandra from ADB, I can still see you there. Is there anything you want to raise? Everybody's quiet. Is there any from any of the panelists? Is there anything last you want to add? No, I can. Okay, so listen, from my perspective, I am actually sitting in Glasgow, and I'm starting to. It's 1 a.m. I think for Alessio, it's 2 a.m. in the Netherlands. So I'm going to suggest that we wrap it up here. Much appreciate the really interesting conversation. There's a whole set of these events running through on the Pacific Resilience Platform right through until November 11th. The Global Resilience Hub, you can access it through the same link that we've shared. When we close down at the top of the hour, our ADB colleagues in Southeast Asia will run an event for 75 minutes, and then we'll hand over to colleagues and others based in Bangladesh who will take us through for events out of South Asia. And then we hand over to Kenya and East Africa before the actual hub comes on live in Glasgow. So it's the full round the clock. We will be reporting the highlights from this conversation in a very short 5-minute summary, which is really difficult, but so much appreciation from our team at ADB. And so thanks a lot, and good night, and happy afternoon to everybody from me.
Thank you, Noel. Good night.
Thank you, Noel.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you,
Thank
Noel.
you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.